Courtney.
Hi, Judy.
So this is our fourth episode of Two Holistic Psychiatrists Talking. And today we thought that we would talk about less known root causes of depressed mood, because there are many reasons that a person can feel depressed, and some of them are things that are not typically thought about by people who are just simply not aware that there are things like nutrient imbalances and toxicity that can contribute to depressed mood. Gut health is something that is more well known, but it's interesting to think about the way that I started to learn about all of this. It was in 2008 when there started to be some buzz on the internet about gluten. And I removed gluten from my diet and noticed very quickly a drop in the level of my inflammation. And that was really the beginning of all of it. And then in 2011, I came across the GAPS healing protocol and did some training with Natasha Campbell McBride, who's the author of the book, The Gut and Psychology Syndrome. And Courtney, you too. You also were exploring GAPS.
Right. And for me, it was after exploring a lot of Candida and yeast related diets. So sugar was the big culprit that on my radar at that time, which, yes, then led me to GAPS.
Right. And then both of us discovered nutrient imbalances and did a training with Dr. William Walsh and learned about methylation disorders and disorders involving a molecule called pyrroles and copper toxicity. And then we went on to learn about toxicity related to mold and how that can affect psychiatric symptoms and depressed mood.
And with that, a lot of co-infection, not necessarily co-infections, but different infections that can contribute to, be it Lyme, Bartonella,
systemic illnesses as a cause of depressed mood. And then most recently, I've gotten very interested in the effect of electromagnetic frequencies on a person's level of inflammation. And Courtney has learned a lot about structural
the structural implications that affect the head and neck and how that can affect the vagus nerve.
Right. So it's just layer upon layer of new information. And as we learn more things, there's more to consider when evaluating a new patient and trying to figure out, why is this person feeling depressed? I mean, apart from things that we all know about, like stress or family trauma or trauma in general.
And I think it's worth adding too that these areas that we're going to talk about, even though we're talking about them in relation to depressed mood, they also are the similar culprits for anxiety, attentional issues, even in autism and dementia. These are the same players that keep coming up for people that globally affect brain health.
Right, because they're the root causes of inflammation in the body and the brain, and root causes of problems detoxifying that then result in inflammation. And it's all the same in some kind of way, though it manifests differently for different people.
Right. And many, if not most, will have a sprinkling of anxiety with attention problems in addition to their depression. But depression is so common, and so many people can identify with that. So that's our
right. And it
focus today.
Be like depression that is like so debilitating that you can't go to work, or that you can't function or take care of yourself or what you need to do, but that you just don't feel happy and you don't feel well.
Right. Not thriving, not enjoying things as much, losing interest.
Mm-hmm. Kind of struggling to get through.
Sure.
So maybe we'll start with maybe we'll start with nutrient imbalances. And what are tip-offs to you, Courtney, like when you see a new patient that they may be struggling with a problem with methylation or with copper toxicity or with elevated pyrroles? Are there certain symptoms that you think about?
Yes, and because there's such a genetic relationship to nutrient imbalances, I mean, certainly we can acquire them through gut health issues, lack of absorption of nutrients. For many, if not most, there's a genetic piece to those nutrient imbalances. So when I go through a deep timeline with people, if there's some issues like from the get-go and within the family, that would raise my suspicion for things like undermethylation, Pyrrole Disorder, or copper overload. But in terms of the Walsh, there's a nice, he has these pictures of like the pie, and then breaks down depression into the pieces of the pie, and undermethylation sort of being the largest percentage of people with depression have undermethylation. And I guess we should comment that the Walsh Research Institute studied thousands of people with brain-related symptoms and found that it was a small handful of nutrient imbalances that kept popping up, and that they found that if they corrected those or optimized them, then symptoms would improve for really most people.
Yeah, and what I wanted to say was, like you were talking about the genetic component and sort of getting a very good history and finding out, has this been a lifelong issue? But that doesn't mean that, at least in my practice, I don't do much genetic testing at all. I don't look at the genetics to figure out what's going on. I look at the clinical picture and how a person is feeling and what their symptoms are.
Right. And similarly, I don't do, I mean, it's rare that I'm seeking out someone's methylation mutations.
Right. That's that useful.
And two, usually it's interesting, I think, in that we can predict what someone's nutrient imbalances are going to be. And that we do blood work to look for methylation, to look for copper levels, zinc levels. We check for pyrroles. So there's blood and urine tests that can help, but it's not terribly difficult to know prior to that testing what someone has because of some of the symptoms that we can talk about.
Right, that there is a very, like, a symptom profile that makes one suspect that someone may be undermethylated. And
Right.
We then do the testing to confirm it, but we already have a strong suspicion by just listening to the person and what they're going through. So maybe we could talk about some of those, because then people who are listening might say, hey, like, I feel like that a lot of the time.
Right.
So what are some of the things that come to mind for you when you think about a person who's undermethylated?
So the way I usually explain it when I'm working with someone is, the spectrum of under and overmethylation. And on one end of the spectrum with undermethylation, people are going to be more detail oriented, somewhat perfectionistic perhaps, maybe have obsessive compulsive tendencies, be strong-willed, maybe highly accomplished or from family that has high accomplishment. And with that, we'll see addiction, we'll see allergies, all that seem to gather around this high histamine that comes with undermethylation.
Right. That's when we do blood tests where we don't, like, the way that we assess if a person is undermethylated is we check their whole blood histamine level. And there's an inverse relationship between methylation status and histamine levels. So if a person has high levels of histamine, they're typically undermethylated.
Right, because we need methylation to break it down, to break histamine down.
Yeah. And, people who have seasonal allergies, they're used to thinking, oh, I need an antihistamine perhaps. And that's like clue that you're a person who has like high levels of histamine. But, like, I've also seen undermethylated people who are not so high achieving and not so detail oriented, but they seem to
Sure.
have like a lot of problems with detoxification. Like they're
Right.
very prone to toxicity, like mold toxicity. And um, in that case, that's because methylation is one of the um, biochemical processes that is involved in being able to detox things.
Right. So it's important for detoxification, breaking down histamine, and then also um, neurotransmitter functioning and how it affects
Mhm.
the receptors for serotonin and dopamine.
So, I mean, one thing that is related to high histamine that we see in our practice a lot is mast cell activation.
Right.
And that causes a lot of symptoms for people and is not a typically recognized cause of psychiatric symptoms, but it's very, very common and is related to high histamine. And the mast cells are these white cells that line the organs of our body. I mean, they're all over the body, but particularly in the places that interface with the environment, and they're part of the immune system and help coordinate the immune response. But when a person has mast cell activation, which is causing adverse symptoms, it's because the mast cells are dysfunctional and they have little granules that have histamine in them and other kinds of substances that cause chemical processes in the body. And when they degranulate, they cause symptoms. So you see a lot of mast cell in your practice too, don't you?
Yes. And I think, there's different things. I think there's a genetic piece there, but certainly it seems mold toxicity will take it to a different level.
Right.
And so then someone can have mold toxicity causing mast cell activation that's flooding someone periodically with histamine, and then they don't have, and if they're undermethylated, then they don't have a good means to break it down. So I do see a lot of people with undermethylation, mast cell activation, and mold toxicity.
Right. That's like a triad.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, I mean, mast cell can present in so many different ways. And very often a person can have very strange neurological symptoms that they will have, seen neurologists about and will be told that that's not following any kind of known uh, anatomical pathway and it's not really possible. So, like, they should see a psychiatrist, when in fact there is like an underlying biological
Right.
reason that they're having the symptoms. I mean, it can cause all kinds of symptoms like lung symptoms, like asthma.
Skin issues, gut issues.
Right. So it's something that should definitely be considered. And what do you do to treat it?
Well, and I would just add, I think for people that have a lot of random physical symptoms that seem to be triggered by random things, be it something they've eaten or medications or supplements or weather changes or walking down the aisle at Target and the Tide fragrance causes them symptoms. I think when there's random symptoms caused by random triggers, that's when I think about mast cell activation.
Me too.
And
Like,
as you said, it's those people that are going from specialists.
feels terrible another day. And like, why? Nothing different.
Right, right. So I start pretty simplistically, and we have a whole bunch of tools in our toolbox for mast cell activation, but I'm usually using higher doses of antihistamines to block the histamine receptors, along with something to stabilize the mast cells so they're not spilling as much histamine when they do destabilize.
Yeah.
That would be something like quercetin I commonly use. But then ultimately the goal is to get to whatever's causing the mast cells to be so fragile. So be it mold toxicity, then really treating that. But it can be the roots of the roots of the roots that we're talking about
Right.
here.
And always to be looking for the root cause, because there's no point in just trying to stabilize the mast cell if the reason that they're having the activation to begin with is that there's some kind of systemic inflammation going on caused by something like mold toxicity,
Right,
other kinds of infections.
right. And I would just say, and from a psychiatric standpoint with mast cell activation, I mean, certainly it can cause depression because of the being so burdened by histamine, causing brain fog and fatigue. That can look like your sort of typical depression, but it can also cause panic attacks, you know, with the whole physiologic stress response, and rage episodes in some people. So it can have quite dramatic
Literally
manifestations.
the cause of almost any psychiatric condition.
Right, absolutely. That comes on sort of abruptly and ebbs and flows.
You know, a lot of people contact me because of wanting to get off of psychiatric medicines.
Mhm.
And, you know, conventional psychiatry is not very skilled at helping people withdraw from medications and often do it way too fast. And many of these psychiatric medicines have an antihistaminic
Right,
themselves. So then when a person is withdrawn from it quickly, they have like a upwelling of histamine. And
mhm.
that, you know, like when the limbic system of the brain gets triggered by all of the stress and trauma of the anxiety that is caused by the elevated histamine, then it can begin to trigger the mast cells, and the mast cells get involved in the whole story. And so it's just important to realize that, like, withdrawing from medication can trigger new kinds of problems that may not have only to do with getting off of the medication.
Right, right. And the underlying root cause would likely still be there.
Right.
So if someone had mold toxicity and mast cell activation, and then they're trying to get off the medication that is maybe providing some antihistamine effect.
Right.
And then, so I agree. I think there's a lot of, I mean, obviously we care about getting to the root cause and getting people to a healthy state to where they don't need medication, but I don't necessarily know how much is being altered as is being suggested, as opposed to the root cause not being ever gotten to when people are coming off these.
Right. And there's often like a misattribution of why they're feeling as badly as they are.
And you know, when I see people come and they've been on multiple trials of medication and they got worse on every single medication, I think about mast cell activation. But also when I hear about people that go off medications, I mean, just that shift in the body of coming off something too quickly or going on something too quickly, if someone has mast cell activation, can trigger mast cell activation.
Right.
So it's never known.
Very, very sensitive and very,
Right.
very delicate. And
And it's never known if they went slower going on and coming off, if they would have been able to have tolerated it if they had mast cell activation.
so I like to, like, if somebody wants to get off of medication, you know, I often want to investigate other possibilities of why were they put on medication in the first place? Like, why were they in so much distress that they needed to be put on medication? And I mean, there is the fact that there is a very low threshold for prescribing medication. And some people are, you know, many people, I think, are put on it inappropriately. And there could have been many other things tried before medication was started. But some people were in such terrible shape that they needed something. And that was the tool that the psychiatrist had, was to prescribe medication. But
Right.
they were in such bad shape was because of an underlying root cause that was not recognized.
Right, which is why we're even talking about this today, with the hope that just this kind of information can get out there.
Right.
Um, I think, the point about medications does sort of lead us, when we were talking about the spectrum of methylation, to overmethylation, though it's not as common as undermethylation.
Yeah.
Those would be individuals who, um, when put on a typical antidepressant like an SSRI, Paxil, Zoloft, Prozac, could have their symptoms triggered because they have too much neurotransmitter activity.
Right. And many of those people, I don't know many, but it's not uncommon for those people to have terrible reactions to antidepressants and even to become suicidal.
Right, right, or even psychotic,
Mhm.
or manic. And
Mhm.
so those would be individuals who are sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum, as we described under methylation. So these would be people more expansive in their thinking, um, maybe less detail oriented, maybe tend to be more artistic and spiritual and creative.
Right.
Also, you're good, they're more friendly and warm, you're a good neighbor, and maybe more talkative, and maybe more, because they have more neurotransmitter activity, more motor, move more, um, very likable.
It is less common than under methylation.
Yes, right, right. And I think Dr. Walsh would say increasingly less common than it used to be, which is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that covers the two of the nutrient, and we should say, actually, because we're talking the specific nutrients that are people seemingly are deficient and overloaded in, for these two. For overmethylation, it's a folate deficiency, whereas for undermethylation, it's a folate excess.
Right. And that's why, there's very often a mistaken attempt to treat. People get genetic testing. They say, "Oh, I'm homozygous for MTHFR," and then they're put on folate, and that often makes them worse.
Right, and so this is really where we're somewhat at odds with what in conventional or allopathic psychiatry, when they have someone that has treatment-resistant depression, they will add folate.
Right.
So that, from our perspective, would only be helpful to the very small percentage of people that are overmethylated, but the most of those people are going to be undermethylated, and it would be what we would be taking people off folate, having them not be on multivitamins with folate,
Right.
not be on a whole high folate diet. It's really the opposite.
Creating a worse problem, right?
Right. And I think Dr. Walsh would say for those low serotonin individuals, but people with depression are those low serotonin individuals.
Right. And people
Those,
with anxiety are those low serotonin individuals.
right.
People who have psychiatric symptoms in general, just, I mean, there is the overmethylated group, but they are, I think,
Right.
rare compared to the rest.
Right. So
So what nutrients do you commonly prescribe for this?
so for undermethylation, um, either methionine and or SAMe, which helps with these methylation cycles that,
Yeah.
referring to undermethylation. And we could later maybe do one just on undermethylation.
Yeah.
And then I encourage a higher protein diet, since that's where we get our methyl, even though diet alone doesn't typically fix this problem.
A lot
And
of
then,
antioxidants too, right?
I'm sorry,
A lot of
a
antioxidants.
lot of antioxidants. And then, as we alluded to earlier, gut health does play into this, because Candida seemingly can worsen undermethylation or even cause it.
Mhm.
So, and then there's even a little bit of evidence that's emerging, about attachment theory, and how, I don't know if you've seen the study about the mice in terms of the licking and grooming, and the mice that weren't licked and groomed had were more undermethylated than the group that were adequately cared for.
Right, because it's not just the genes that you inherit, but the environment can affect
The expression.
the expression. It's called epigenetics, and they can turn genes on and turn genes off, and people can experience trauma, or animals can experience trauma, and then they become undermethylated.
Right, right. So that can be a piece, but when we see a family, for example, of engineers and accountants and, and then they bring in their child, let's say that is showing signs of depression, or their teenager,
Yeah.
and they're similarly on a path into a technical career, we would be thinking likely the genetics
Right,
predisposition for undermethylation.
right,
But so those are the kind of things that I would use. Nutrients, as you said, the antioxidants, but specifically nutrients to help with the methylation cycles. B12 is part of impacting methylation.
right. And for everybody, vitamin D is so important.
Right. So that's something we check regularly. Mm-hmm.
Regularly check, and I recommend high doses of it.
Mm-hmm. And then do you want to comment on overmethylation, what we use to treat that?
I don't think so. I mean, you mentioned folate, but I mean, a lot of the also antioxidants, right?
Right, niacinamide for some people, and B12 obviously there too.
It's just a much less common condition seen today
Right,
when I'm testing people.
right.
So what about pyrroles? I mean, that's something that is tested with the urine, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And
And for me, I could say it's one of the things that I'd like to see show up, because we typically can impact that easily and quickly.
right, it's the nutrient imbalance that shifts most quickly with treatment.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing that's especially satisfying about treating someone with pyrroles is typically people that have elevated pyrroles, they have very low stress tolerance. It's hard for them to be around large groups. They might be particularly shy or have social anxiety. And so this can be like lifelong, just interpersonal struggles that correcting for their zinc levels and correcting for a B6 deficiency
Right.
can just be life-changing, and it's so neat to see.
Right. I mean, those people also sometimes have, like, as a marker of zinc deficiency, they have white spots on their fingernails. So that's something that can be like a telltale marker of it.
Right, right. And they'll often have skin issues, maybe autoimmune type symptoms or diagnoses.
Yes.
It seems they have a lot of connective tissue symptoms, not unlike individuals with mast cells, mast cell activation. We're probably talking about the same thing from two different schools of thought.
Right. So many of these things that we're talking about are all related. It's like a web, and
Right.
one thing is related to another thing, and it's rarely just one thing in isolation. Like, people who have high pyrroles generally have very high levels of inflammation in their body.
Right. And the reason we talk about them separately is because they each have their own set of tools. So when we're treating someone, we're sort of pulling together different tools specifically for them, which is also why this area of medicine is so hard to research, because there's no one size. Somebody walks in with depression and this is what you get. This is someone walks in with depression, and for us that could be a whole handful of different things and different constellations, and how we would treat it would be different for each person.
Right. And generally the treatments are with nutrients. They're with antioxidants and amino acids and maybe fatty acids. And there's no money in that for pharmaceutical companies. And so conducting large scale research is very expensive. And so it doesn't happen. And so then there's criticism launched this is all just anecdotal, when there's not the funds to do the research that would be needed, but that holistic practitioners see routinely in their practices, that identifying these particular problems and treating them with these nutrients makes a big difference.
Right, right.
So the third nutrient imbalance that is very common is copper toxicity. And when I get a history from a patient and hear that there's a lot of symptoms that are related to hormonal fluctuations, like a person has like terrible PMS, or they had a postpartum depression, or terrible trouble with menopause, anything that is
Or
hormone
birth control.
birth control pills, right? That's a tip off for me. Or they had an IUD implanted that had copper. That's a tip off for me that this person may be having trouble with copper toxicity.
Or rage. And we could see that, I think it's more classic with copper, but we might see that with pyrroles as well, like just difficulty managing temper.
Yeah. Yes. Stress tolerance.
And all of these are children and adults. I mean, we're talking about these nutrient imbalances being identified.
Right. Copper often is, people have attentional problems, pyrroles too. And pyrroles, they often have learning disabilities.
Right, which there again, it's interesting how correcting the nutrients, how some of those learning disabilities fall away.
Yeah.
If gotten to, if the biochemistry is corrected for early enough.
Yeah. So what other symptoms are related to copper toxicity?
So fatigue and headache can be big problems there. And there's some unusual things like metal sensitivity, and again, we could say about pyrrole, there's the whole light, sound.
Right, that is a
sensitivity.
And then that is often related to mast cell stuff as well, that people have tremendous sensitivity. Like, how could it be that they just feel so sensitive to light and to sound, and they're just so impinged upon by the environment? Their stress resistance is just really lowered.
Right. And I mean, I'm a believer that pyrroles are mast cell activation and connective tissue symptoms together. Like if you go through them, and most people with mast cell activation have some connective tissues, be it joint laxity or, think about connective tissue. It's our vascular system, it's our joints, it's our skin, it's everything.
Right.
But hernias, varicose vein, there's evidence that people have in their families that there's a vulnerability in terms of how structurally sound their tissues are.
Right.
So I guess we should comment on, we talked a little bit about treatment for pyrroles using zinc and B6. And if someone's pyrroles are especially high, we'd also use evening primrose oil. We'd still use antioxidants there too.
Right.
And with copper though,
excreted, they pull B6 and zinc out of the body. Like the molecules of the pyrroles just attach to those and make the levels of those really low. And zinc and B6 are just essential for all kinds of biochemical processes in the body.
Right. So we need B6 to make neurotransmitters, so to make serotonin and dopamine and GABA. And then zinc we need for immune health, gut health.
Part of the reason why they have, poor immune function.
Right. I think zinc is huge. I love zinc.
I love it too, but not everybody can, take a big dose of it quickly. Some people really work up slowly. And I actually have had a lot of patients in my practice who have trouble tolerating it. It gives them headaches. And so there's some zinc that's like food based, and you have to take kind of more pills because it's not just like taking pure zinc, but some people can tolerate that more than they can tolerate zinc.
And we should add that we check zinc levels and we are recommending based on those levels.
Yeah.
I too see a lot of people, I mean, I go very slowly, even if they don't, I mean, if someone has high copper and we give zinc too quickly, it could mobilize the copper and exacerbate high copper symptoms. But
Right.
even if they don't, if they happen to have mold toxicity, which is, we find so common, that it will stir things up, I find. And so
Think stirs up mold.
I don't know, like, I can't say that it does definitively, but if somebody has toxicity, it seems that those are the people
More.
that when I try to, and I think it has to do with getting that metallothionein working. You know, you're giving zinc, this very strong antioxidant in the body called metallothionein starts to do its thing. And if it's too much too fast, independent of copper.
Yeah.
So it is great, and it's something that requires a lot of care.
Yeah.
In
Well,
giving
in
it.
general, it's good to proceed cautiously. And I generally don't recommend to my patients to muscle through anything.
No, right.
Um, if they're feeling worse, it's not, I don't see it as like a healing crisis. I see it as like a signal to back off.
Right. Kind of meet the body where it's at.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So our learning about gut health led us sort of to the Welsh Research Institute. And then while treating people using these nutrient imbalance approaches, which is very satisfying because it has a lot of impact, we were still recognizing that there was people that wasn't helping, or it was only getting them so far.
Right. Right. And I had the experience myself of, I have a blog, and one of my readers wrote me a letter and said, you know, given your other interests, I think you would be very interested to learn about mold toxicity because it's something that is a very common cause of psychiatric symptoms. And I'd heard about mold toxicity, but I hadn't really explored it deeply. So I thanked her, I filed the email, and then I had a problem in my basement, and I started feeling really sick with all kinds of symptoms that I now know are related to mold toxicity, like feeling depressed and feeling bloated and having ringing in my ears and not sleeping and urinating frequently. And then I thought, wow, you know, like, let me look at that email that that person sent to me. And I
From
looked
above.
at one of these really remarkable synchronicities. And I thought, you know, I think that's what's going on with me. And I had someone come and do an assessment. And in fact, there were very high levels of mold in my basement. It had occurred after there had been a flood, and that was secondary to a remodeling project. And I had the basement remediated and then started down the path of learning about mold toxicity. And that has been just a huge part of my practice now. And Courtney was having a lot of symptoms that were unexplained. And I said, you know, I think you have mold. And
Right. I was having a lot of sort of low-grade neurologic symptoms and fatigue and a lot of brain fog.
yeah,
And then and you know, we never, like for myself, I never quite know when that would have started. When I was younger, when we lived in Virginia, there was a flood there, and we, after the flood, moved back to our home. So it's hard to know, you know, and with patients, we don't know how long are they carrying around toxicity, and then when do they reach a threshold that they become symptomatic.
right.
Many people will have you know, they'll have a deterioration when they move into an environment or workplace where there's water damage, but not always. And so that took us both down this path of, wow, mold toxicity is huge. It's so common.
It's so common and causes so much distress and so much difficulty for people, and it's just not on the radar of conventional physicians.
Right. So depression, anxiety,
Brain
attentional, brain fog, fatigue. Some people neurologic issues, not everybody. Some people gut issues, sinus issues, respiratory issues.
often the way it's expressed is through this mast cell activation that can affect every organ system of the body. So
Right.
when there's just like lots and lots of symptoms, but not always. I mean, sometimes it can just be that a person has some kind of treatment resistant depression, and they've been on a million.
Mhm.
Um,
And I've seen a number of people who had an onset of what was like a classic bipolar disorder presentation with the moving into a environment.
yeah,
I mean, it really turned, we think about root cause, but the way they had such a classic presentation, it makes me wonder how many people with your bipolar disorder type 1, with clear-cut manic episodes as being the primary
right.
symptoms, have mold, because these 3 particular people, that was
And
when it started.
it makes a big, big difference for people to treat it. And the way that it's treated is initially with binders, like depending upon the type of mold toxin, which is measured by a urine test. There's different binders that are used specifically for different types of mold.
Right. So the mold toxins are in the body, go to the liver, gallbladder, into the gastrointestinal tract, and they get reabsorbed unless we're using binders that will bind them in the gastrointestinal tract and then take them out of the body.
Right. And one of the reasons for using binders is also because then when you initiate a trial of antifungals,
Mm-hmm.
then a person tolerates the antifungals better than if
because you're killing the mold and yeast often, and then more toxins are getting released, right?
So everything needs to be done very carefully and very cautiously and very slowly, and it's definitely a marathon and not a sprint.
With mold toxicity, right?
Toxicity, yep. But it's so important to identify it, and once it's identified, it's very treatable.
And it is one of those where we do see like it's a gradual, steady improvement. People will look back and go, oh, gee, I wasn't able to read a month ago and I'm reading now.
Yeah.
Or I wasn't able to go walk around the block and now I'm doing that each day. It's just this slow accumulation of functioning that comes back.
Right, or improved sleep, or they're not urinating constantly, or
Right. And then some people it's quite dramatic, and those would be those, less commonly where the person may not need an antifungal treatment. And we should say the antifungal treatment can be of the sinuses.
Right, it could be
and gastrointestinal tract.
Yeah. So
one last point I was going to say about mold is, when we talk about, I think we were talking about bipolar disorder and even new onset mental illness that we'll see with mold toxicity. I do believe there's a lot of young people that go off to college and become toxic in dorms.
Absolutely.
They'll leave school, and the stories that our culture will tell itself is, they weren't motivated, they weren't disciplined, they couldn't handle being away from home, and they could just become toxic. I'm sorry?
They had trouble separating that they weren't prepared to be a young adult on their own, when in fact they're like being poisoned in their dorm room by mold toxins.
Right. And the trajectory of their life just, goes in a different direction because this isn't well known.
Yes. I think there's just tremendous suffering and loss of function that occurs due to unrecognized mold toxicity.
And we'll have to do one or more conversations on that by itself. I mean, each of these things we're talking about.
Right. There's so much to say.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's it for today. We talked about a lot of different things, and as you said, we just touched on them. There's a lot more to say about each of them.
Right. And you mentioned EMF, and we could just list a couple of these even other things that we could talk about in the future, but
Right.
We haven't talked about like the implications of even head trauma or upper cervical instability.
And head trauma in the relationship to mast cell, like
right.
Everything is all related. I mean, there's many more things to talk about here.
But at least this gives anyone listening an idea of some areas that are impacting a lot of people that just aren't well known, but that are, from our standpoint, very treatable.
And as long as you don't recognize what you're seeing, you don't know what to do for it, and the treatment, it's not going to make it, it's not going to address the root cause to give a antidepressant.
Right. Not that they can't be life-saving and help people, even while these root causes are, evaluated and treated for. Yeah. Some people don't need them at all, and then some people will. Yeah. To get them, to the other side of these.
Yeah, it's just good to be flexible and to use all of the different tools that are available, and not to be dogmatic or have just one way of thinking about things. All right.
Okay, Judy. Till next time.
Okay. Bye.